I met George Orwell once. It was the winter of 1949 in London. I was there covering the post-war recovery, Marshall Plan stories, mostly the kind of thing that made good copy back home. Optimism, rebuilding, the future. I was young then, hungry for the next assignment, the next dateline. I thought I understood what mattered. A mutual acquaintance, a journalist whose name I've long forgotten, mentioned that Orwell was in town, staying in a cramped flat near University College Hospital between treatments. He's not well, the man said, but he might talk to you. He doesn't talk to many people anymore. I didn't know why I should visit a novelist. I wasn't covering the arts. I had deadlines, interviews lined up, stories that felt urgent. But something in the way the man said it, he doesn't talk to many people anymore, made me curious. There was a weight to those words, a finality. So I went. The flat was on the third floor of a narrow building that smelled of damp and coal smoke. The stairs creaked. The hallway was dark. When Orwell opened the door, I was struck first by how thin he was. Not thin in the way of a man who'd missed a few meals, but thin in the way that suggested his body had begun the long process of giving up. The room itself was small, cold, spare. A single window looked out onto a narrow street slick with rain. There was a desk covered in papers, a few books stacked unevenly, a teapot that had gone cold hours ago. Orwell sat in a wooden chair by the radiator, wrapped in a wool blanket despite the feeble heat struggling up from the pipes. His face had the gray, waxy quality of illness, the kind you don't recover from. We shook hands. His grip was light, careful, as though he was afraid of breaking something. "Mr. Cronkite," he said. His voice was soft, clipped, precise, the voice of a man who'd spent his life choosing words carefully. "You'll forgive me if I don't stand long." I told him I appreciated his time. I asked how he was feeling. He looked at me for a moment, weighing the question. "Tired," he said. And then after a pause, "Afraid." I didn't know what to say to that. So I asked what he was afraid of. He studied me as though deciding whether I was worth the effort of an honest answer. Then he smiled, barely, just a slight movement at the corner of his mouth. "That I've written the wrong books," he said. I had read Animal Farm by then. It had been published a few years earlier, and it was clever, sharp, the kind of allegory that made you nod in recognition. A satire of Stalin, of Soviet totalitarianism. That's what everyone said. That's what the reviews called it. That's what I thought. But Orwell didn't want to talk about Stalin. "People think I wrote about dictators," he said quietly. "They think I wrote about them, the Russians, the Germans, the other side. They're relieved, I think. They read it, and they feel safe because it's happening somewhere else, to someone else." He paused. The radiator ticked softly. Outside, rain continued its steady percussion against the window. "But I wasn't writing about them," he said. "I was writing about us." I asked what he meant. He reached for the teapot, poured a cup that had gone cold, and held it in both hands without drinking. His fingers were long, thin, the nails slightly blue. "I mean that the things I fear most, they don't require jackboots. They don't require midnight arrests, or marching columns, or secret police dragging people from their beds. Those are crude, obvious. People resist those eventually." He set the cup down on the table beside him, untouched. "What I fear," he said, "is what people will accept willingly, what they'll embrace because it makes their lives easier, or safer, or more comfortable. That's the real danger, not force." We spoke for nearly 2 hours that afternoon. I don't remember all of it. Some conversations blur with time, the details fade, the exact words escape you. But I remember the cadence of it, the way Orwell spoke in careful, measured sentences, as though every word had weight and consequence, as though he no longer trusted language to mean what it said. He talked about his time in Spain during the Civil War. He'd gone there as a journalist, ended up fighting. He talked about how quickly the truth could be rewritten, how the people he'd fought alongside were declared traitors by morning, enemies by noon, how the newspapers lied with absolute confidence, and the readers believed them because it was easier than doubting, because doubt required effort, investigation, the willingness to be uncomfortable. "I watched it happen in real time," he said. "I was there. I knew what had happened. And then I read the papers, and they described something else entirely, a different battle, different heroes, different enemies. And people believed the papers, not because they had evidence, but because the papers sounded authoritative." He coughed, a dry, harsh sound, and waited for it to pass. "That's when I understood," he said. "The truth doesn't matter if no one's willing to defend it. And most people aren't willing. It's too much work. It's too uncomfortable. It's easier to believe what you're told. Language," he said, "is where it begins. Not in the prisons, not in the courts, in the words." I asked him to explain. He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time that afternoon, there was something like urgency in his voice. Not anger, not panic, just a quiet, desperate need to be understood. "You change the meaning of words," he said, "and you change what people can think. You make freedom mean surveillance. You make peace mean war. You make truth mean whatever is convenient for those in power. And if you do it slowly enough, gently enough, people won't even notice. They'll repeat it themselves. They'll defend it. They'll attack anyone who questions it. He paused, watching me. And when they do that, he said quietly, "You no longer need police." I remember sitting there in that cold room, silent. The radiator ticked its steady rhythm. Rain tapped against the glass. Somewhere below, a car passed, its tires hissing on wet pavement. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary city. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell them that we were different, that in America, in Britain, we had a free press, free elections, constitutional protections, a long tradition of skepticism and debate, that we weren't like the Soviets or the Nazis or whatever dark specter he was conjuring from his imagination. But I didn't say any of that, because even then, I think, I knew he wasn't talking about systems of government. He was talking about human nature, about comfort, about the slow, imperceptible drift toward believing what we're told because it's easier than questioning it, because questioning requires courage, and courage is exhausting. People don't lose their freedom all at once, he said. They lose it in pieces. A convenience here, a security measure there, a small surrender, and then another, and then another. Each one seems reasonable at the time. Each one is justified by some immediate need, some pressing concern. And one day they wake up and realize they've traded everything they had for the promise of safety, or comfort, or simplicity. He looked directly at me. And by then it's too late, he said, because they don't even remember what they've lost. They don't have the language for it anymore. I asked him, God help me, I asked him if he really believed that, if he honestly thought that the democracies, with all their protections, all their history, all their safeguards, could drift into the kind of nightmare he'd imagined in his books. He was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he said finally, but I know this. The danger isn't that someone will take your freedom by force. The danger is that you'll give it up for something that feels reasonable at the time, something that sounds sensible, something that promises to make your life just a little bit easier, a little bit safer, a little bit simpler. He coughed again, longer this time, a wet, rattling sound that made him wince and clutch at his chest. He waved me off when I started to rise. I'm fine, he said, though clearly he wasn't. I just don't have much time left to say these things, and I'm not sure anyone wants to hear them. There was no self-pity in his voice, just a kind of weary resignation. People want to believe in progress, he said. They want to believe that history moves in one direction, forward, upward, towards something better. And maybe it does sometimes, but it doesn't move that way automatically. It requires constant effort, constant vigilance, and most people are too tired for vigilance. I left not long after that. The light was fading, and I had an evening appointment I couldn't miss. We shook hands again at the door. His palm was warm, slightly damp. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Cronkite," he said. I told him I would. I told him to do the same. He smiled at that, a real smile this time, though sad. "Too late for that, I'm afraid," he said. I never saw him again. He died 13 months later in a hospital room, alone, his warnings unheeded and largely unread. I've thought about that conversation many times over the years, more than I expected to, more than seems reasonable for a single afternoon with a dying man I barely knew. I thought about it during the McCarthy hearings, when language became a weapon and fear became policy and careers were destroyed by whispers and accusations that couldn't be challenged. I thought about it during Vietnam, when the words we used, pacification, strategic Hamlet, collateral damage, credibility gap, became ways to avoid saying what we meant, ways to make the unbearable sound reasonable. I thought about it during Watergate, when the President of the United States looked into a camera and redefined truth in real time, when "I am not a crook" became a statement that required parsing and analysis rather than simple belief or disbelief. And I think about it now, decades later, as I watch what we've become, not because we're living in the world Orwell described, not entirely, not yet, but because I see the pieces of it, the comfort, the convenience, the slow, steady erosion of our willingness to ask hard questions, to tolerate discomfort, to resist the easy lie. Television, the medium I've spent my life in, has given us wonders. It's brought the world into every living room. It's shown us things we never could have seen otherwise. Wars, moon landings, moments of triumph and tragedy unfolding in real time. But it's also made us lazy. We believe what we see, not because we've verified it, but because it looks real, because it's there on the screen, presented with authority and confidence, because it's easier than doubting. We accept surveillance because it promises safety. We accept slogans because they sound true. We accept simplicity because complexity is exhausting, and we're all so very tired. And somewhere in that process, we stop asking the questions Orwell wanted us to ask. Who decides what's true? Who benefits from our comfort? What are we surrendering without noticing? George Orwell wasn't a prophet. He was a warning. He didn't predict the future. He described the present. his present, our present, the eternal present of human nature, seeking the path of least resistance. He described the slow drift, the willing compromise, the quiet trade of freedom for convenience. He described us not as villains, but as ordinary people who stopped paying attention, who got comfortable, who forgot that freedom requires maintenance, that truth requires defense, that democracy requires participation. And the tragedy, I think, is that we've proven him right, not by becoming a tyranny, but by learning to live with just enough freedom to feel safe and just enough control to stop noticing the difference. We haven't arrived at Orwell's nightmare, but we've taken steps toward it, small steps, reasonable steps, steps that seemed justified at the time. And that, I think, is exactly what he was afraid of. Not the dramatic collapse, the gradual accommodation. Orwell wasn't afraid of tyrants. He was afraid of comfort. And that's the thing we should fear most. And that's the way it is.